Hello, and on behalf of Marianne and myself, thank you for joining us in this presentation on our first attempt to see if it's possible to create a typology in literature studies and reviews in engineering education. To understand why this has not really been attempted before, we need to understand the history of engineering education itself. The first civilian school of engineering was founded in France in 1747, around the time of the start of the Industrial Revolution. Due to wars on both continents, the first US engineering degree wasn't awarded until 1835, and the first chair of engineering wasn't established until 1840 in London. The first association for engineering education was formed in 1893, when the American Society for Engineering Education was formed. It appears that the first dedicated scientific journal on engineering education, the IEEE Transactions on Education, was published in 1958. SEFI was founded in 1973, but it took until 1985 before the first compendium on engineering education was published by John Haywood. Within Europe, the first issue of the European Journal of Engineering Education was published in 1985. And only in 1993, the American Society for Engineering Education converted their Journal of Engineering Education to a purely scholarly journal, which allowed the field of engineering education research to really come to bloom. However, it would take until the early noughties for the first formal graduate programs in engineering education to be established, with the US leading the way from 2003, followed in 2004 by Aalborg University in Denmark in Europe. From this perspective, it is safe to say that engineering education research is still a relatively young field. It's therefore not surprising that only in the last 10 to 15 years dedicated engineering education review papers have started to appear. If you were to skim over the review papers that have been published over the past few years, it appears that the systematic review papers are the most popular format, ever since Borrego, Foster and Freud called for them to become the gold standard in 2014. But are systematic review papers the way forward? Or should we look at why we are conducting a review in the first place, as is common in other fields of study? This is how we came across a paper in Health Studies by Booth and Grant dating from 2009. They created a typology of literature reviews and identified 14 different review types, using a systematic approach which I will discuss in a moment. These 14 review types range from a critical review and a literature review or narrative review to various forms of systematic review, each with their own purpose and characteristics. For the sake of time, I'll not discuss each review type in detail. For that, I refer to the paper. To come to this typology, they used a process of literary warrant, that is, deriving classes and the names of classes from existing literature to see what the most used terminology was. They then mapped all the review types they found against the so-called SALSA Framework, describing the characteristics based on the method of searching employed, how the appraisal of the literature found was carried out, the method of synthesis, and how the analysis of the literature included in the review was carried out. Next to that, they also listed the pros and cons of each review type and illustrated each type with an example from their field. This got us thinking, however, does a similar typology exist in engineering education research? Or do we have different review types? To investigate this, we carried out a SCOPUS search using the keywords literature and/or review to appear in the title, keyword, or abstract of 3 high-ranking engineering education journals: IEEE's Transactions on Education, ASEE's Journal of Engineering Education, and SEFI's own European Journal of Engineering Education. This initial search resulted in 417 hits. By reading the abstracts and, where necessary, the whole paper, all non-pure review papers were eliminated. This resulted in a total of 37 review papers being identified, with 14 appearing in the EJEE, 16 in the JEE, and 7 in the TOE. If we plotted the results per year, it can be seen that over the last few years the number of review papers appears to be on the rise, but it's dropped off again in 2018 and 2019. Next, all papers were read in full, and using the process of literary warrant, the terminology used by the authors of each paper to classify their paper was noted down. This resulted in 13 different self-qualifications, with systematic review and literature review being the most popular, as can be seen from this word cloud. Names with an asterisk indicate that the term is also found in Booth and Grant's typology. We then proceeded to analyze each paper using the SALSA framework, and based on those outcomes we looked if, and if so which review type, as listed in the paper by Booth and Grant it matched. This resulted in 9 matches, with the systematic, the literature review and the critical review being the predominant types used in engineering education review papers. No review paper was found that did not appear to fit in the Booth and Grant typology. If we then looked at the typology by Booth and Grant again, and we overlay our results, we can see that 5 review types were not identified in the review paper studied for this research. This itself is not really a surprise, as some of these missing review types require a number of underlying reviews. With only 37 reviews identified in a 19-year period, we may simply not have yet sufficiently suitable review papers available within EER to carry out these type of reviews. This is again a sign that the field of engineering education research is still growing and is not yet as mature as, say, the field of health research. This then brings me to the conclusions of our work. It appears that classification of review papers according to the typology of Booth and Grant is possible. The advantage of using this classification is that it gives more purpose-based review methods than proposed by Borrego, Foster and Freud. Also, even though some review methods may not yet exist in engineering education due to the overall low number of review papers, but they may come in the future. It was also interesting to note that IEEE's Transactions on Education published a lot less review papers than the other 2 journals examined, although this may in part be due to their strict page limit of 6, making them less attractive. As with all studies, there are also limitations to this study. We only looked at 3 journals in the field. It would be interesting to extend this study to include more journals from the list as published by the Research in Engineering Education Network REEN. Also, we found that our search and appraisal methods were hindered by the lack of good keywords, abstracts, controlled and uncontrolled vocabulary terms used by journals. We were grateful for those papers which used the structured abstract approach, as this greatly eased our work. We hope to expand this study in the near future to see if more review types can be identified. With that, I've come to the end of our presentation.